us. The resurrection principle is asking us, will we call forth and will we cultivate our own gifts? The second aspect of that, when we begin to cultivate our gifts, is to remember that everything that comes along that appears to be a stumbling block is actually a stepping stone. Does anybody else have any stumbling blocks in their life? We all do. Many of us, a few weeks ago, I told you when the title of my talk was Put It to the Test. And I've learned whatever the title of my talk comes, I get to live that. And so little did I know when that talk came up that I would have something show up in my life that appeared to be a huge stumbling block. And yet what I'm coming to realize, it's one of the greatest stepping stones that one could imagine. And it's still in the works, and I look forward to sharing this with you when the time is just right. And it's something that you'll be excited about and you'll see, so no worries, nothing to worry about, but it's my own thing. And each of us, many of you have talked to me about things in your life that appear to be a stumbling block that are actually a stepping stone. This is where we look to nature and to those who have gone through things before in cultivating their Christ potential. You see, the last few days of Jesus' life, he did apparently crazy things like curse a fig tree and watch it die. Why? Because it wasn't yielding its gifts. He talked about talents and why we didn't want to bury our talents, helping us to understand that sometimes when things look like they aren't working, it's because it's ready for something else to be born. The lesson of the caterpillar. When a caterpillar nears its transformation time, it begins to eat ravenously, becomes heavy. It outgrows its own skin until it is too bloated to move. It then attaches itself to a branch and begins to naturally form a cocoon, this chrysalis, much like the tomb or the dark nights of the soul that we go through. And we find ourselves in those places, and it feels like we're standing on a pile of stumbling blocks, or something's not working. Within the chrysalis, a miracle is actually taking place. Tiny cells that biologists actually call imaginal cells begin to appear. These imaginal cells are wholly different from caterpillar cells. They carry different information. They vibrate to a different frequency, the frequency of the emerging butterfly. And so at first, the caterpillar's immune system perceives these new cells as foreign, and it begins to fight them off in self-defense. And yet, the new cells are growing in such number that they will not be deterred, and a new generic code begins to fully awaken. As this happens, the caterpillar's immune system is eventually overwhelmed, and the body then becomes a nutritious soup which will now feed the emerging butterfly. When the butterfly has nourished enough of that food, the chrysalis begins to become transparent, no longer needing the restriction of the safe tomb that held it. And the struggle of freedom is not yet quite free, for soon the butterfly must open in just the right time and will then take flight into a new form of life. As we cultivate our gifts, we will encounter stumbling blocks, and yet the lesson of the caterpillar is to know that each one is truly a stepping stone. And so the third affirmation is, I allow every apparent stumbling block to gracefully become a stepping stone. And when we do that, one of the final ingredients that we can use in our day-to-day life in working with the resurrection principle is to always reach higher. Because when you're reaching higher, you're being lifted higher for the very intention of aspiring towards something greater, to bring forth a greater demonstration of your potential will magnetically draw you to that. So to close, I chose two little short stories that are kind of unlikely. You know, there's lots of individuals that we can talk about and look at their life as an example and see how they accomplish great things. But when you think about the resurrection principle, it's important to realize that nobody is ever too low to be lifted. The resurrection principle is working in every life, and your life and my life is no exception. How many of you remember Al Capone? Al Capone was the mobster who basically owned Chicago, who did everything from bootlegging to prostitution to murder. And it was in a time when it was a real problem for that area. Well, a lot of Al Capone's success was due to the lawyer he had. Does anybody know the lawyer's name? Fast Eddie. Yeah. Fast Eddie. And Fast Eddie was rewarded highly for what he did because he kept Al Capone on the streets and out of jail. One of the things, he had a house in Chicago that was a city block long, and everything that one could imagine. But it says Eddie had a son in his life, and Fast Eddie was ruthless with the exception of this son. And when his son was born into his life, something began to happen in Fast Eddie's life that wanted him to reach higher. Because he realized that though he could give his son everything on the face of the earth almost, he could not give him a good name or a reputable example. One day, Fast Eddie reached higher and made a different decision, a difficult decision. He decided to cooperate with the police and turn in Al Capone. And because of his testimony, Al Capone was arrested and went to jail. Well, within a year or so, Fast Eddie was killed, as he thought he probably would be. But he knew that in the life of crime that he had set out, that he was going to probably die one way or the other. But he had reached for a higher idea. And in so doing, he had made a good choice and had served his son. When Al Capone's body, when Fast Eddie's body was found on the streets of Chicago after he was gunned down, in his pocket he had a rosary, a crucifix, a religious medallion, and a poem. And this is the poem. Would you give me that last song? You Raise Me Up. The clock of life is wound but once, and no man has the power to tell just when the hands will stop at late or early hour. Now is the only time you own. Live, love, toil with a will. Place no faith in time, for the clock will soon be still. You see, we cannot achieve the realization of a greater purpose and remain passive. And even Fast Eddie made a good decision, knowing that his time was coming, but carrying those precious things with him and within him now. Ernest Wilson, who's a Unity minister who was minister to the stars in California, wrote in the book, The Week That Changed the World, the Christ nature in us is the same today. It calls us to heights of daring. It seems at times to put all things at risk. It points to uncharted territory. It points in ways that sometimes seem at variance with a worldly security or acclaim. The second story, we have a lot of military families or people with military connections. During World War II, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare was a fighter pilot assigned to a carrier in the South Pacific. And his entire squadron was set out on a mission, a sortie mission. And as he got up and they got out, he realized they had forgotten to top off his fuel. So he radioed in and said, I don't have enough fuel, I can't make it. And they said, turn around and come back. Well, on the way back to the ship, he saw a bunch of enemy aircraft headed for the men he had just left. And in a split second, he had to decide what to do. So one man on his own, like a crazy man, dove into the fleet of enemy aircraft. And he just went berserk, basically. But he acted so courageously and so crazily that it actually damaged 5 of the enemy bombers and created enough havoc that they turned around.